There is a moment in American history that most people believe could never happen again. A moment when the government walked straight into the homes, vaults, and safe deposit boxes of its own citizens and took their money. It was 1933. The country was collapsing. Banks were failing one by one, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a single order, Executive Order 6102, that made it illegal for Americans to own the very metal that had backed their wealth for generations. Gold, not taxed, not regulated, confiscated. You had to hand it over. You were paid a fixed government price, and refusing meant fines, prison, or both. Weeks later, the government revalued gold higher, captured the profit for itself, and used it to rebuild the financial system. Ordinary Americans never had a chance. People today treat that story like a relic of a distant century, a strange, unrepeatable moment in the chaos of the Great Depression. But history is never a museum piece. It's a pattern, and patterns repeat, especially when the pressures that created them return. Because here's the part almost nobody sees. If gold was the strategic metal of 1933, silver is the strategic metal of today. The world doesn't run on gold. It runs on electricity, satellites, missiles, solar arrays, radar systems, precision guidance, microchips, and every single one of those technologies needs silver, not as decoration, not as jewelry, as a critical industrial input that cannot be replaced, cannot be faked, and cannot be substituted at scale. And while global demand surges, global inventories are collapsing. Governments are drawing down strategic reserves. Defense contractors are competing with solar manufacturers for the same dwindling supply. For the first time in modern history, the world is on track to use more silver than it produces, not for 1 year, but for many years in a row. So, what happens when a metal essential to national security becomes scarce? What happens when its price breaks $50, then $80, then approaches $100, and threatens to destabilize defense supply chains the U.S. military cannot afford to lose? What happens when the financial system, already strained, already fragile, realizes that the silver held in paper ETFs may not exist in the quantities promised? And what happens when a government facing record deficits and rising geopolitical conflict must choose between allowing private citizens to hoard the metal or declaring that silver, like gold in 1933, has become too important to remain in private hands? This isn't prophecy. This is the arithmetic of scarcity, the logic of national survival. The mechanism empires always resort to when critical resources slip beyond their control. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. And the question hanging over 2025 is simple. If Executive Order 6102 was the first chapter, is silver about to become 6102 version 2.0? To answer that, we have to go back, not to the future, but to the moment this pattern first appeared, and that means returning to 1933. To understand what may happen to silver tomorrow, we must return to the only moment in American history when the government openly seized the wealth of its own citizens. A moment when financial collapse forced the United States to cross a line it had never crossed before. The year is 1933. America is on its knees. Unemployment sits above 25%. Farmers are abandoning their land. Banks are failing so fast that entire towns wake up to find their life savings gone. The Federal Reserve has lost control of the monetary system. Gold, the foundation of the dollar, is draining out of the banking system as terrified citizens hoard it in basements, safes, and buried chests. The problem wasn't greed, it wasn't speculation, it was survival. When people lose trust in government, they flee to whatever asset cannot be printed. And in 1933, that asset was gold. But for the U.S. government, gold wasn't simply a symbol of prosperity, it was the oxygen of the financial system. Every dollar in circulation had to be backed by a fixed amount of gold under the gold standard. And as citizens pulled gold out of the system brick by brick, the entire structure of American finance began collapsing inward. By March 1933, the Treasury was days away from running out of legally required reserves. If gold withdrawals continued, the U.S. would default, not on a foreign bond, not on a war debt, but on its own currency. So President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a presidential command unlike anything before it, Executive Order 6102. It stated, in plain language, that Americans could no longer legally own monetary gold. Coins, bars, bullion, all of it, had to be surrendered to the Federal Reserve. You were paid 20 7 per ounce. the official government price, refuse, and you faced fines up to $10,000 and 10 years in prison, the same penalty as bank robbery. This wasn't a tax. This wasn't regulation. This was directed monetary seizure, justified as an act of national rescue. And here's the part most people forget. The gold wasn't confiscated because the government wanted it. It was confiscated because the system could not function without it. Within months of collecting the nation's gold, the government revalued it to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase, instantly expanding the value of its reserves and devaluing the dollar. The revaluation didn't just enrich the government, it rewired the entire economy. It allowed the U.S. to inflate away a massive portion of its debt, recapitalize its banking system, and forcibly reset the financial order. Everything that followed, the New Deal, the recovery, the war boom, became possible only because of that one action, the seizure and revaluation of a strategic metal. And this is the key that ties 1933 to today, because while gold was the lifeblood of the financial system then, silver has quietly become the lifeblood of the strategic industrial system now. What governments do when survival is at stake has a distinct pattern, and that pattern is about to repeat, but aimed at a different metal. To see why, we have to examine how empires behave when strategic resources run scarce, a story far older than the United States itself. Across history, long before the United States existed, empires rose and fell for one simple reason: they lost control over the metals that powered their dominance. It is the part of history never taught in schools, but once seen, it becomes impossible to ignore. Every empire eventually collides with the same wall. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire didn't crumble because of invading tribes. Those invasions only delivered the final blow. The real collapse began when Rome started losing access to the silver mines of Hispania, the richest in the ancient world. Roman currency, the denarius, was literally made of Spanish silver. When the mines declined, Rome faced an impossible choice: cut spending or dilute the currency. They chose dilution. 90% silver became 40, then 5, then almost none. As the metal disappeared, trust disappeared with it, inflation surged, soldiers refused devalued pay, and the empire's military machine fractured. Rome wasn't defeated by armies. It was undone by a shortage of strategic metal 17 centuries later. Britain followed the same pattern. Its dominion over the globe, the fleets, the colonies, the industrial advantage, was built entirely on metals: copper for ship hulls, tin for alloys, silver for navigation instruments, iron and steel for cannons, rails, and machinery. Whoever controlled these metals controlled the oceans, and whoever controlled the oceans controlled global trade. But by the late 1800s, Britain's domestic production could no longer satisfy its industrial appetite. The empire didn't expand because of ideology or destiny. It expanded because it needed mines. In India, South Africa, Australia, Canada, its power grew or shrank with its access to metal. When the world plunged into total war in the 1940s, every nation understood the same truth: war is a competition for resources. The United States rationed copper, nickel, and aluminum. Germany invaded for mines. Japan expanded into Southeast Asia for tin, rubber, tungsten. But one metal mattered more than all the others: silver. It was essential for detonators, radios, radar, chemical production, and the electrical systems needed for weapons research. The U.S. Treasury allocated more than 400 million ounces of silver to the Manhattan Project alone, not as currency, but as an industrial material the war effort could not function without. In each of these eras, the same lesson emerged: when a strategic metal becomes scarce, private ownership becomes secondary, national survival becomes the priority. Roosevelt's gold confiscation was not an anomaly. It was the modern expression of an ancient pattern. And as the world moves deeper into an era where silver is essential to energy, weaponry, digital infrastructure, and geopolitical leverage, that pattern is tightening again, because governments do not intervene when they want to, they intervene when they must. And today, that moment is approaching faster than at any time in modern history. For the first time in modern history, the world is consuming more silver than it produces. What used to be a cyclical shortage has become a structural one. And when a strategic metal slips into structural deficit, governments make decisions they would never consider under normal conditions. That is the moment when private ownership collides with national necessity. The numbers are stark. Global silver inventories have been drained year after year. The major vaults that once held hundreds of millions of ounces now sit at dangerously low levels, their shelves half empty, their reserves spoken for long before delivery. Industrial demand, solar panels, electric vehicles, advanced batteries, medical devices has risen so rapidly that even record mine output can't catch up. Above-ground stockpiles, which once acted as a buffer, are now evaporating. This is not a temporary imbalance. It is a long-term shortage accelerating into crisis. But the pure supply problem is only the first pressure point. The second is far more explosive. For 40 years, the price of silver has been artificially suppressed by a small group of financial institutions using concentrated short positions, contracts representing more silver than physically exists. As long as the world believed the supply was abundant, this structure held together, but the moment real scarcity becomes undeniable, the leverage snaps. Prices don't rise gradually, they gap upward violently. $50 becomes 80, 80 becomes 100, and past 100. A different kind of alarm goes off inside government offices because silver at triple digits doesn't just hurt investors, it threatens national defense. Unlike gold, which sits in vaults untouched, silver is consumed. Every radar system, every missile guidance unit, every satellite component, every high-efficiency electrical system depends on silver's conductivity. Once used, it cannot be economically recovered. In a world where energy transition and geopolitics define national power, silver is not a luxury metal. It is an operational requirement. This is where the pressure becomes political. A nation can tolerate wealthy citizens hoarding gold. It cannot tolerate wealthy citizens hoarding the metal required to build weapons, microchips, surveillance systems, and energy infrastructure. When industrial supply chains become unstable, governments respond, not because they want control, but because the alternative is strategic vulnerability. And then there is the quiet failure nobody talks about, the ETF problem. Most silver investors don't own silver. They own promises, shares in financial vehicles that claim to hold physical metal somewhere in a vault. But as the shortage deepens, the gap between paper silver and real silver widens. If even a small percentage of ETF holders demanded physical delivery, the system would break instantly. The metal simply isn't there in the volumes advertised. Governments know this. Central banks know this. Defense agencies know this. The only ones unaware are the retail investors holding digital claims on metal that may not exist. Put these pressures together: shrinking supply, soaring industrial demand, fragile financial structures, and national security dependency, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Once silver enters the triple-digit range, the incentives shift. The government does not need to confiscate silver the way Roosevelt confiscated gold. It only needs to declare silver a critical material and impose emergency measures, restrictions on private hoarding, mandatory reporting of large holdings, export controls, industrial prioritization, or forced redirection of ETF reserves. Confiscation doesn't always look like men knocking on doors. Sometimes it looks like a signature on a document redefining who is allowed to own what. And that is the threshold the world is now approaching. The pressures that once pushed Roosevelt to seize gold in 1933 are not relics of a forgotten era. They are here again, stronger, wider, and fused into a global system more fragile than at any moment in the last century. The signs are not subtle. They are visible everywhere for those willing to look. The United States now carries more debt than any nation in human history. Interest payments alone exceed the budgets of entire federal departments. Every quarter, the Treasury rolls over trillions in obligations, praying the bond markets remain stable. But stability is an illusion held together by a world that still believes the American financial system is unbreakable. Scarcity of strategic metals, especially silver, threatens that illusion. At the same time, geopolitical rivalry has entered a phase the world hasn't seen since the Cold War. China is accelerating military production. Russia has redirected entire industries toward wartime footing. The Middle East is destabilizing faster than new coalitions can form. In each of these arenas, silver plays a silent but irreplaceable role. Guidance systems, communications arrays, advanced batteries, surveillance platforms, high-efficiency energy systems. The nations that control silver will control the technologies that define the next decade of power. Energy transition adds a second layer of pressure. Solar manufacturing consumes more silver each year than the previous year's total mine output. Electric vehicles require nearly twice as much silver as traditional combustion engine cars. Grid modernization, battery storage, and semiconductor production add even more strain. This isn't a commodity story anymore. It is a national infrastructure story. And then comes the pressure that nobody wants to acknowledge publicly: the fragility of the paper-silver market. Governments, regulators, and major financial institutions understand the imbalance. They see the mismatch between physical supply and the enormous mountain of derivative contracts pretending to represent it. If the public ever demands delivery at scale, the financial system that relies on these instruments will buckle. Silver at $50 is a market anomaly. Silver at $100 is a national security threat. Silver breaking above that level is a systemic crisis. This is why the modern parallel to 1933 is not hypothetical. It is structural. When the price of a strategic metal threatens the integrity of the financial system, the defense supply chain, and the geopolitical position of the nation, intervention becomes a matter of state survival. It will not look like the past. There will be no telegram from the White House ordering citizens to surrender their silver. Modern governments operate with more subtle, more surgical instruments, restrictions on exports, new reporting requirements, industrial priority claims, sudden temporary emergency measures, or reclassification of silver as a controlled material. Each step would be framed not as confiscation, but as protection: protection of markets, protection of industry, protection of national defense. And just like in 1933, the public won't realize what has happened until the rules have already changed. History's pattern is not repeating. It is returning in a more complex form, one shaped by globalized supply chains, digitized markets, and a world where every major power is scrambling for the same shrinking pool of metal. And the consequence of that return leads to the final question, the only question that truly matters. How does an individual protect themselves when a system begins preparing for forced scarcity? When a system reaches the point where scarcity becomes policy and policy becomes force? Individuals are left with a choice: trust the rules or understand the pattern, because the pattern has never changed. When a strategic metal becomes the backbone of national survival, personal ownership shifts from a right to a privilege, and privileges can disappear overnight. Silver is crossing that threshold, not in theory, in real supply chains, in defense procurement logs, in industrial forecasts that show demand climbing long after mining output peaks. The price doesn't cause the crisis. The price reveals it, and once it moves beyond the control of financial engineering, the government will act, not to punish investors, but to secure the resources it believes it cannot function without. In moments like these, protection never comes from systems built on promises. Paper claims can be redefined. ETF shares can be frozen. Delivery rules can change. What exists only in digital form can vanish with a single regulatory adjustment. The only silver immune to reclassification is the silver you physically possess, beyond custodians, beyond intermediary structures, beyond the reach of sudden policy shifts disguised as national necessity. History rewards those who understand that governments intervene not when it is fair, but when it is required. Rome diluted its coins. Britain seized control of colonial mines. Roosevelt reclaimed gold for the stability of the dollar. In every era, citizens who held real assets endured. Citizens who held paper representations did not. The coming decade will not ask whether silver is valuable. It will ask who controls it. And in that question lies the quiet edge between vulnerability and sovereignty, between those who wait for instructions and those who prepare before instructions arrive. Because if there is one truth that echoes across centuries of monetary resets, resource seizures, and emergency economic decrees, it is this: when strategic metals become the foundation of national power, ownership does not disappear, it simply shifts, and only those who hold the metal itself keep their place in the story.